The folder slid across the table with terrifying precision. It stopped right between the candied yams and the rolls. Monica's smile was clinical, a thin, frozen line of social expectation. She said they felt this was best before the wedding moved forward. I didn't reach for it yet. The red and gold lights on the tree blinked like an alarm I should have heard months ago. Jeffrey straightened his cuffs, looking at me like a budget line to be cut. I looked at Kayla. She knew she had always known. In that moment, seeing the folder move across the table like a formal summons, would you have opened it or walked out the door? I didn't reach for the folder immediately. Instead, I sat there and let the silence expand until it became its own presence at the table. In my profession, silence isn't an absence of activity. It's usually where the most critical work happens. When you're standing over an open skull and a bleed starts, you don't scream. You get quieter. You narrow your field of vision until only the problem remains. That's what I did then. I narrowed my focus until Monica's frozen smile and Jeffrey's restless fingers were just biological data points. Looking back now, I realized they confused my stillness with a lack of weapons. It's a common mistake people make when they believe their social standing is a form of armor. Jeffrey was leaning back, his chest puffed out slightly, radiating a manufactured sense of victory. He looked like a man who had just closed a difficult deal, unaware that he was actually the one being audited. Kayla was still staring at her plate, her fingers tracing the rim of her wine glass with frantic, repetitive motion. I could see the pulse in her neck, 110 beats per minute, at least. She was terrified, not for me, but for the disruption of her comfortable world. The red lights from the Christmas tree caught the sweat on Jeffrey's forehead, making him look feverish. They thought they were applying pressure. Monica probably imagined that her cold words in this heavy document would bend me. If I'm being honest, it was almost comical. Earlier that week, I had spent 6 hours holding a human brain in my hands, navigating a landscape of gray matter where a single millimeter of error meant the end of a man's ability to speak or remember his children's names. That is pressure. That is a weight that settles in your marrow. Sitting in a heated dining room in Beacon Hill while someone tries to dictate your marriage terms, that isn't pressure. It's a performance. It's a group of small people trying to convince themselves they aren't fragile. Jeffrey cleared his throat, the sound rough and impatient. He was an administrator, a man who spent his days moving pieces of paper to feel powerful, while I spent mine moving the needle on survival. I realized then that to them I wasn't Caleb. I was a transport tech, a piece of hospital infrastructure that had somehow found its way into their heirloom chairs. It took me years to understand that for people like the Hendersons, you are only as valuable as the utility you provide. Since they believed my utility was limited to pushing gurneys, they felt entitled to strip away my dignity before I even joined the family. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed once 5:30 p.m. The sound was crisp, cutting through the heavy scent of glazed ham and expensive perfume. Monica's eyes flickered. She wasn't used to being ignored, and my lack of reaction was already starting to fray the edges of her composure. She had prepared for a protest, for an argument, or perhaps for me to beg for their approval. She hadn't prepared for a clinical evaluation. I hadn't lied to them, not technically. I simply allowed the Hendersons to inhabit the space of their own assumptions. It's a habit I developed after a decade of being the prize in a room full of social climbers, a desire to see what's left of a man when you strip away the institutional power. In the hierarchy of that Beacon Hill dining room, I was a hospital transport tech, a nobody whose primary function was to be polite and stay out of the way. But in the reality of the city 3 miles away, I was the chief of neurosurgery. My base pay alone was $115,000 every single month, and I managed a $5 million research endowment that determined the future of surgical technology. Looking back now, I realize my mother was right when she said that a person with good character doesn't need to announce himself. She spent 26 years in a county records office, a woman of quiet, relentless competence who believed that the world would eventually do the announcing for you. She used to tell me that if you really want to know who people are, you should let them think you can do absolutely nothing for them. That had been my philosophy with Kayla. I wanted one relationship in my life that wasn't a transaction. I wanted to be known as Caleb, the man who enjoys a cold walk and restores vintage timepieces. Not Caleb, the medical world equivalent of high-ranking authority whose signature moves millions of dollars, that it suits me to live plainly. My townhouse outside of town is warm and orderly, but there is no expensive art or dramatic furniture to signal my net worth. At the time, I didn't realize that my refusal to lead with my resume would be interpreted by Jeffrey as a sign of weakness. He saw my lack of flashy displays and my quiet answers as a sign of low intelligence or lack of ambition. To a man like him, whose entire identity is a subscription to a lifestyle he can barely afford, someone who doesn't broadcast their value must not have any. He believed I was a laborer, someone who handled the heavy lifting and the menial tasks, and I let him believe it because he never once bothered to ask a deeper question. If I'm being honest, I was hungry for the one thing that authority had never brought me: unguarded affection. I wanted to know that if I lost the steady hand and the medical degree, there would still be someone who wanted to sit across from me at breakfast. But sitting at that Christmas table, I could feel the audit of my soul concluding I was being weighed against their version of a legacy, and because I wasn't carrying a title, they recognized I was being found wanting. The proper meeting I had been promised was actually a character assassination disguised as a dinner. The air in the room felt heavy with the scent of pine and the unspoken rules of a class I had intentionally stepped away from. Jeffrey and Monica were looking at me, waiting for a crack in my silence. They had provided the terms of my entry into their world, and those terms were written in the cold legal ink of a charter that treated me like a liability. I wasn't just a guest anymore. I was a problem that needed to be managed. I wanted to know if she loved Caleb the man or Caleb the chair. I was about to get a very expensive answer. Jeffrey didn't wait for my permission to begin his monologue. He cleared his throat, a sound of heavy administrative self-importance. To him, this table wasn't a place for Christmas dinner. It was a negotiation where he believed he held all the leverage. He spoke about legacy protection, a term usually reserved for dynastic wealth, though his version lived mostly in an overpriced mortgage and a title that sounded far more impressive than it actually was. He described my role at the hospital as essential but unskilled infrastructure, a transport tech, someone who moves the equipment that actually makes the money. In his eyes, I was a depreciating asset that Kayla was inexplicably trying to acquire. I've spent my career observing the utility gap, that silent, psychological space where people determine your worth based solely on what you can facilitate for them. If you cannot help them climb, you are a ladder with missing rungs. To Jeffrey, I was a social debt he wasn't willing to underwrite. He looked at me and saw a man who would eventually overdraw on the family's reputation. The social governance charter in the folder wasn't just a prenuptial agreement, it was a complete forfeiture of my autonomy. It dictated that I would have no say in our combined financial future. Any income I earned, the meager wage he assumed I made, would be managed by the family office to ensure it wasn't wasted. Monica added her voice, a silk-wrapped blade that my career stagnation must remain a strictly private matter. I wasn't to mention my job at their country club or during their high society holiday mixers. I was to be a silent shadow, a placeholder husband who didn't ruin the aesthetic of their perfect family photograph. Jeffrey's hubris was fascinating in a clinical sense. He sat there radiating authority, yet he was merely a mid-level administrator at Street. Jude's Memorial, the very institution where I am the primary shareholder and chief of staff, he had fallen into the trap of the illusion of inherited authority. He believed that because he worked in the vicinity of power, he owned a piece of it. He saw the hospital as his kingdom, unaware that he was simply a tenant whose lease I was currently reviewing. He believed he was protecting his daughter from a low-status man, never realizing he was insulting the man who determined his departmental budget. At the time, I didn't realize how deep his insecurity actually ran. He talked about his upcoming promotion to senior vice president as if it were a foregone conclusion, bragging about how the board members, men he claims were his close associates, already had the paperwork on their desks. I knew exactly where that paperwork was. It was currently on my desk at the hospital, unsigned, alongside an audit of the $2 million deficit in his specific department. He was a man struggling with corporate failure, trying to lecture me on the virtues of stability. He leaned forward, his face inches from mine, the smell of red wine and desperation hanging between us. "Sign it, Caleb," he whispered, his voice a low, jagged threat. "A man in your position should be grateful just to be allowed a seat at this table." I finally opened the folder. It didn't feel like a legal document in my hands. It felt like a biopsy report of their character. I wasn't reading for the clauses or the fine print. I was reading for the intent. I noticed a specific provision that would require me to resign from my unskilled position if my schedule ever conflicted with their family events. It was a formal erasure of my autonomy, a way to ensure that the ghost in the machine stayed in its place. Looking back now, I realize that the most dangerous people aren't the ones who scream, but the ones who think they can quietly legislate your worth. I took the pen, the heavy, gold-tipped one I had been given by the governor after I removed a tumor from his daughter's brain, and I began to mark the margins. Monica's face twisted. To her, it was just an expensive pen being used by a common hand. She didn't recognize the engraving on the clip or the weight of the gratitude it represented. "Jeffrey," I said, my voice maintaining that low, steady frequency I used before the first incision, "this charter mentions a concern for financial stability. It's an interesting priority considering the current state of your department." Jeffrey's hand froze on his wine glass. "Excuse me? The Human Resources Administration at Street Jude's," I continued, watching the color begin to leave his face. "There's a $2 million budgetary deficit that's been flagged for a secondary audit this month. It's a significant shortfall for a man who talks so much about legacy and protection." The room went medically cold. Jeffrey stared at me, his eyes darting toward Monica and then back to the folder. He looked like a man who had just realized the patient on the table wasn't under anesthesia anymore. If I'm being honest, it was the first time all evening I felt a flicker of genuine curiosity. How does a mid-level manager explain a $2 million hole to the man who unknowingly holds his promotion in his pocket? It took me years to understand that when you let people think they are the smartest in the room, they will eventually hand you the rope to hang them with. Jeffrey had spent the last hour treating me like a liability, never suspecting that I had been the one reviewing his departmental failures just 48 hours prior. He stammered, trying to find a way to ask how a tech could have access to confidential fiscal data without admitting that the data even existed. "How do you know that?" Monica asked, her voice losing its silk and finding its edge. "That's highly sensitive institutional information." "I listen," I said simply. And I read. I slid the folder back toward the center of the table, exactly midway between the yams and the rolls. It looked smaller now, a petty piece of paper in the face of a $2 million reality. I met Jeffrey's eyes, and for the first time, I saw the arrogance being replaced by a cold, creeping fear. "You asked for clarity," I said, leaning back as the clinical stillness returned to my posture. "But you're operating on an audit that hasn't been updated in years." I stood up slowly, pushing my chair back. The sound of the wood scraping against the heirloom rug was the only noise in the room. Jeffrey looked up at me, his mouth slightly open, the arrogance finally draining out of his face to make room for a raw, primitive confusion. I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored blazer and pulled out my hospital identification, not the temporary visitor's badge he expected, but the gold-embossed executive credential that very few people at Street Jude's ever see. I laid it on top of the social governance charter. "My full name is Caleb Elias Thorne," I said, my voice as flat as a heart monitor. "I am the chief of staff and the primary shareholder at the institution you currently work for. I am also the man who spent 5 o'clock this morning reviewing your application for the senior vice president position. I've only been in this seat for 6 weeks, having relocated from out of state. I intentionally delayed my official press release and lobby portraits because I wanted to see the truth of this hospital and this family without the filter of my title." Monica's wine glass made a sharp clink as it hit the table. If I'm being honest, it was the first time I had ever seen her look genuinely small. The mystery man they had spent 3 hours dissecting was actually the person who held their financial oxygen in his hands. I looked at Jeffrey. He wasn't an administrator anymore. He was a patient in cardiac distress, his skin a shade of gray that suggested he was finally calculating the cost of his hubris. "The $2 million deficit in your department isn't just a number on a spreadsheet," Jeffrey, I continued. It's a reflection of character. I was going to sign your promotion today as a wedding gift to Kayla, not because I thought you were the best man for the job, but because I wanted to believe you were the man your daughter described. I was even prepared to settle the $50,000 in personal high-interest debt that our mandatory executive background check flagged the debt you've been hiding from your wife. Monica's head snapped toward Jeffrey. $50,000? She whispered. Jeffrey didn't answer. He couldn't. He was paralyzed by the realization that he had just insulted the one man who could have saved him from his own incompetence. Looking back now, I realized that their shock wasn't born of remorse. It was the horror of a predator who realized they had tried to bite something much larger than themselves. They had treated me like a nobody because they believed there were no consequences for cruelty toward the unskilled. They were wrong. In a professional ecosystem, every interaction is a data point. Jeffrey's data point had just resulted in a terminal diagnosis for his career. I turned to Kayla. She was looking at me as if I were a stranger, which in a way I was. She didn't see Caleb, the man who brought her soup when she was sick. She saw the chairman. She saw the power. Her failure to stand up for me when I was just a tech had been a choice of comfort over conviction. She had been the silent investor in their version of family, and she had just realized her equity was worthless. I reached across the table. I didn't wait for her to move. I took her left hand. Her fingers were cold, like marble, and I slid the sapphire ring off her finger. The stone caught the red light of the tree one last time before I dropped it into my pocket. I was looking for a partner who could see through a title, I said, letting the clinical weight of my words settle over the table. I found a family that can't see anything else. Monday morning at St. Jude's Memorial has a specific frequency, a low rhythmic hum of institutional machinery preparing for the week's trauma. I arrived at 6:00 a.m., long before the administrative offices opened to finalize the paperwork I had mentioned at that hollow dinner table. There was no joy. It was simply a matter of correcting a diagnostic error in the hospital's leadership. Jeffrey had been categorized as an asset for too long. It was time to reclassify him as a liability. I watched from the observation deck of the main atrium as Jeffrey arrived at 8:00 sharp. He was wearing his best suit, likely hoping that a display of professional uniformity could patch the holes I had torn in his composure 48 hours prior. I saw him approach the executive elevators, his hand reaching out with the reflexive confidence of a man who believes he owns the air he breathes. He swiped his key card. The light on the reader turned red. He tried again, his movements growing more frantic, a series of sharp, desperate swipes that yielded the same result. The institutional lockout was absolute. Looking back now, I realize that the most profound form of power isn't a raised voice. It's the quiet deactivation of access. Jeffrey stood there, staring at the small plastic card in his hand, as if it had betrayed him, unaware that the system had simply recognized him as a foreign body and moved to isolate him. He wasn't met by me. High-status moves are rarely direct. Instead, he was met by the hospital's chief legal counsel and 2 security officers. They didn't escort him to his office. They escorted him to a small, windowless briefing room on the ground floor. There, he was handed a memo. It wasn't a termination notice. Firing him would have been too clean, a quick exit that would have allowed him to play the martyr at his country club. The general counsel presented him with a choice: a criminal referral to the district attorney for the $2 million deficit, or a voluntary forfeiture of his executive contract in exchange for a lateral entry into the operational grounding program. To stay out of prison and maintain his health benefits, he had to accept the very role he once mocked. Jeffrey was being moved to the front lines of transport and logistics. He was being given the exact job he had mocked as unskilled infrastructure. His new office was a metal desk in the basement loading dock, and his primary responsibility was the coordination of gurney traffic, the very gurneys he thought I spent my life pushing. It was a documented procedural execution of justice. I stood behind the one-way glass of the partition as he read the document. I watched his shoulders slump, his posture finally succumbing to the weight of his own hubris. This wasn't revenge, it was an audit. I had placed him exactly where his character dictated he belonged. It took me years to understand that true justice isn't destruction, it's a mirror. It's the act of showing someone the world they've created and forcing them to live in it. Jeffrey looked up then, his gaze catching the glass where he knew I was likely standing. He didn't scream. He didn't protest. Slowly, with a hand that trembled with the realization of total defeat, he raised his fingers to his brow. He finally, in an act of absolute surrender, bowed his head. I sat in my townhouse that evening, the silence feeling less like a void and more like a clean, sterile room after a successful operation. I made a cup of coffee, the same cheap grocery store brand I used to share with Kayla. If I'm being honest, it tasted better now. There was no longer a need to perform humility or to hide the truth to protect a fragile hope. The social governance charter sat on my kitchen counter for a few hours, a stack of paper that had once tried to legislate my worth before I fed it into the shredder. The sound of it being reduced to ribbons was the only closure I needed. Looking back now, I realized that it wasn't a win to lose the woman I intended to marry. There is a specific kind of grief that comes when you realize you were the only one invested in the version of a person that didn't have a price tag. I had been the silent investor in their version of family, footing the bill for their respect with my own dignity, and when I stopped cooperating, the entire structure collapsed. I had wanted Kayla to be my anchor, but she turned out to be just another part of the utility trap, a psychological space where love is a subscription service that gets canceled the moment the rungs on your ladder stop climbing. It took me years to understand that authority is often just a costume we wear to keep the cold out. Whether it's a high-ranking title in the military or the chief of neurosurgery role in a major hospital, those labels are institutional armor. They protect you from the world, but they also prevent the world from seeing the skin beneath. I had tried to step out of that armor for a few months, hoping to find something real, and I discovered that some people are only capable of loving the metal. They couldn't see the man who finds peace in the silent, precise ticking of a restored watch movement because they were too busy looking for a reflection of their own ambition. I still think about that dinner often, not with anger, but with the same detached curiosity I used to study a rare pathology. Jeffrey and Monica weren't unique. They were just symptoms of a broader social condition where human value is audited like a balance sheet. They treated me with caution because they didn't know my rank. But true character is revealed by how you treat those you believe have absolutely nothing to offer you. The moment they thought I was unskilled, they believed I was disposable. In my world, a survivor's anchor is the thing that keeps you steady when the pressure becomes lethal. For me, that anchor is the knowledge that my value isn't something that can be granted or revoked by a board of trustees or a family in Beacon Hill. It is internal. It is the steady hand in the middle of a 6-hour surgery and the discipline to walk away from a table where respect is not being served. The hardest part of seeing people clearly isn't the reveal the moment the titles come out and the power shifts. It's the quiet realization that follows the understanding that they were never who you hoped they were. Clarity, even when it's cold, is always better than a comfortable lie. I'm 36 years old, and I finally understand that the most important surgery I ever performed didn't happen in an operating room. It happened at a Christmas dinner where I removed a toxic expectation from my life before it could reach my heart. Have you ever experienced a moment where you realized someone's love was actually just an appraisal of your utility? What did you do when you finally saw the truth? If this story resonated with you, I'd really like to hear your perspective. And